Did this guy just crawl out of a prison camp? A cop chuckled. He shoved a chair toward the defendant like tossing away trash. He cracked jokes in front of the judge, calling the man a clown without a lawyer. He ordered cuffs when the defendant refused to speak, but he didn't expect the black man to pull out a badge. Director, FBI. The courtroom was packed, yet after his words, the entire system fell silent. Justice was once a joke, now it's staring back at the one laughing. What would you do? What state do you live in? The district court convened on Monday morning. Enveloped in the damp air, thick with the scent of old paper, ink, and stale coffee. Half the seats were occupied primarily by court staff, a few interns, and a group believed to represent the local police department. Everything was quiet, mundane, like countless other minor trials that had taken place here. Then, the left door swung open without warning. Two security officers entered first, their expressions as serious as if escorting a serial killer. Between them appeared a black man. Not handcuffed, but so closely flanked it seemed he might explode at any moment. His white shirt was wrinkled, the collar stained with a dark, dried blood spot, as if it had been exposed to cold wind for hours. The courtroom lighting wasn't overly bright, but sufficient to reflect his strangely calm gaze, devoid of anger, devoid of pleading, silent as stone and cold as steel. He neither glanced sideways, greeted anyone, nor reacted when a woman in the front row sighed with pity. The two officers escorted him to the defendant's seat without a word, nodded slightly, then stepped back. The entire courtroom seemed to skip a beat. Someone coughed softly. A few chairs creaked, attempting to fill the unnamed sensation spreading through the room. The man sat down, back straight, eyes fixed on the blind spot ahead, the still empty judge's bench. No one knew his name. No lawyer sat beside him. No family member waited in the hallway. An unusual emptiness surrounded him like a vacuum of identity. Even the court clerk, after glancing at the file before her, paused for a few seconds, furrowed her brow, then looked toward the technical room. No residential address, no guarantor, no recorded occupation, no criminal record. She murmured softly enough that no one could hear clearly, but her suspicious gaze was unmistakable. The judge appeared a few minutes later, a middle-aged white man with a slightly red face from nasal irritation, walking stiffly as if he'd sat too long at his desk. He looked down at the first paper on the table, then up at the defendant. A second time he flipped through the file, gently rotated the pen in his hand, then tapped the microphone lightly. The trial begins. No one spoke. About 5 seconds of silence passed. Then, from the audience, a child's voice rang out. High, clear, and more inadvertently revealing than any adult's words in the room. "Is he a bad guy, Mom?" Everyone turned. A boy of about 5, with curly hair and wide, honest eyes, was tugging at his mother's hand and pointing at the defendant. The woman blushed, pulled her son close, and bowed her head, but it was too late. A young officer standing behind chuckled softly. Then another burst out, "If you look at that face and don't see a problem, I need an eye exam." Laughter spread, initially sporadic, then in succession. Some nodded, some patted their thighs, others exchanged glances like people who'd found their morning topic. The defendant remained motionless. He showed no embarrassment, no reaction to the child's question or the mocking laughter around him. His eyes maintained a steady coldness, like a lake about to freeze. This lack of response made the atmosphere even more bizarre. Typically, an innocent person would protest. A guilty one would shrink, but he, silent, as if accustomed to public scrutiny, accustomed to mockery, accustomed to disbelief. The judge cleared his throat, trying to restore the courtroom solemnity. "Defendant's name?" he asked. No one answered. The clerk turned and whispered, "No name in the file." Once again, the judge furrowed his brow. He leaned toward the microphone, changed his tone. "You have no legal representation?" The man nodded, slowly, decisively. "Self-representation?" Another nod. "Do you wish to make any statements before the charges are read?" He looked up, meeting the judge's eyes for the first time. Not a word, just a gaze lasting exactly 3 seconds. Enough for the judge to lean back slightly in his chair, as if to avoid something invisible. Something was amiss, He felt it, but like everyone else, he chose to ignore it. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence, not out of fear but confusion, and that confusion was truly frightening. It was the feeling when someone doesn't get angry when insulted, doesn't seem surprised when belittled, doesn't react when grouped with scum, because they've lived too long in that state. Perhaps for him, this was just a repeat of events that had occurred hundreds of times. Or perhaps not. Perhaps, this time, he sat there for a reason no one in the room was smart enough to recognize. But at that moment, no one cared about that possibility. People only enjoyed the feeling of collectively mocking someone without a name, without a voice, and without anyone to defend them. An office worker sitting at the end of the row secretly turned on his phone to record the courtroom. In the center of the frame, the black man still sat upright, the light reflecting off the dried blood on his collar like a ribbon, tightening memories exposed under false justice. Another person took a photo and immediately sent it to an internal chat group. This morning, self-presentation live show. Got your tickets? Accompanied by a laughing emoji. No one yet knew that that morning, they were not the audience. They were playing roles without realizing they were supporting actors. In a trial, not to judge a person, but to expose a system. But at that time, laughter still echoed throughout the courtroom like the sound of permitted power, of unconscious domination, where the knife wielder didn't need to know who bled. As for the man, he said nothing, didn't need to. He just sat there, like a fixed shadow, like a printed exam placed on the table for those in the room to fill in the wrong answers themselves. It was a trial that began with laughter and would end in a silence no one dared to name. But at that moment, only one thing was certain. The door had opened, and those who laughed first would have only a few minutes left to laugh again. The last chuckle in the courtroom hadn't even faded when a man's voice rang out, thick with disdain. "I've heard plenty like you, always screaming about justice, about human rights. Then you get arrested and you start whining. You show up in court playing the saint. It's hilarious." No one was surprised. No one objected. The words slid through the air like a dull blade, slicing without mercy through the last shreds of pride left on the defendant's face. A few soft laughs followed, like heads bowed in complicit approval. A uniformed officer shot a look toward the defendant, curling his lip provocatively. Maybe this guy thinks he's the star of some action movie. Betty looked in the mirror this morning and saw Denzel Washington. The room erupted in laughter. Not like a courtroom, but like the back lot of a factory mass-producing prejudice, where arrogance was dialed up to the max, and the pin pulled from a grenade made of dignity. The black man remained seated. No blinking, no flinch. His eyes didn't shift, didn't twitch, didn't tremble. His lack of reaction, in a space where every glance begged to drag him down and grind him into the floor, was exactly what made the air suddenly feel too silent, too tight, but only for a moment. That tension was quickly torn apart by another officer, who pulled out his phone and played a freshly extracted body cam clip. "Watch this. This part's gold." The screen trembled, the audio crackled. The footage appeared, an arrest at night, flashing lights. The defendant thrown to the ground, arms raised as ordered, but the words "resisting, he's resisting," barked over and over. A scream, a kick, then black. The screen froze. Someone asked, "That's it?" The officer grinned. "Nah, tech guys say that part's corrupted. Perfect timing, right?" A young court clerk scoffed, muttering as if absent-mindedly, "Yeah, well, corrupted is just the new word for edited." He stepped outside briefly, returned with his phone, already cued to another clip. This one recorded that very morning. Shot from the audience benches, decent quality, capturing the defendant entering the courtroom. Light catching on a dried blood stain like a stroke of fate. Add this laughing filter, slap on some TikTok music over his silent entrance. Boom! Viral, he chuckled while editing. Title it what? Oh, this morning's black show. Nailed it. Laughter erupted again, louder, more chaotic, stripped of any pretense of restraint. Some younger attendees stood up to get a better view. A secretary giggled so hard she covered her mouth, tears rolling down her cheeks. A security team captain leaned close to a female staffer and whispered, "Bet you this guy played a corpse on Law and Order." The woman burst out laughing, dabbing at smudged mascara, breathless as she added, "Yeah, but a corpse with expressive eyes." In a corner, an older officer sat arms crossed, lips pressed tight like he was thinking. When a colleague tapped his shoulder and asked, "What, you feeling sorry for him?" he shrugged, squinted at the defendant, and muttered, "Just wondering how long he can take it." The defendant didn't turn, didn't reply, didn't show a flicker of strain, no frown, no trembling hand, no bowed head. His silence wasn't surrender. It was like a thick pane of glass, reflecting every word, every laugh, every peeling layer of moral skin from the faces surrounding him, a mirror in which none could escape the image of themselves, mocking another while unknowingly exposing their own nakedness to the truth. But not one person in the room was sharp enough to see it. Minutes later, the judge turned to the tech booth, instructing them to play the official clip from the body cam on the large screen. Lights dimmed, the footage rolled. Same scene, the defendant emerging from a dark alley, hands raised in compliance, only for the shout, "Resisting! Obstructing!" to coincide with a blow to his back. Then, black. The screen froze. A small line of text appeared in the corner. Error 418. Frame corrupted. The whole room laughed like it had been choreographed. Someone whispered, "Criminals can hack body cams now?" The officer near the screen turned back and said loudly, "He didn't have to hack it. The system did it for him," then roared with laughter. The laughter thickened, spreading like smoke in a windowless room. It was no longer sound. It was a punch delivered at full volume, a denial of existence. A sentence passed without a signature. Each laugh was a bullet fired from the gut, no aim required, but always hitting the heart of the silent one. And the man sitting there, upright, gaze unchanged, was the one target they couldn't touch. So they fired mockery instead, hoping to chip away at him piece by piece. This wasn't a trial, it was a performance. A pantomime of fake authority staged by people most terrified of one thing, the silence of someone who refuses to beg. A door guard leaned toward his friend and whispered, "His face isn't reacting. But, I don't know, something feels off." The other smirked, "Off because you're soft. Don't let a stare shake you. Just keep laughing." And they did, long, loud, as if laughter would always be exempt from karma's tab. On the evidence review table, a file was slipped into a plastic sleeve, stamped "processed." No one asked how it had been processed, who approved it, or who made edits. A tech unit had even been ordered to delete the original from temporary archives, pending further investigation. But what is there to investigate when everything already played out in plain sight? Perhaps no one wanted to know. Or maybe they all knew, just none dared be the first to admit they had laughed at the wrong time. And in the eye of that storm, the man remained the same, still upright, still with blood on his collar, still with a gaze as quiet as a verdict waiting to be read. But those who laughed never realized they had begun the trial with a blade they themselves dragged across their own honor, a blade without edge, yet one that would draw blood exactly when no one expected it. The room grew quiet, but not because the laughter ran out. It quieted because no one wanted to be the last one caught laughing once it sank in. He had said nothing, yet every word they uttered had already become evidence. No one needed to accuse them. They had done it themselves, with mouths left open too long. And in that moment, every second of that morning, every mocking laugh recorded, every sneer, every share of that video was no longer a joke. It was an indictment, growing, silent, relentless, and irreversible. The bitter aftertaste of laughter still clung to the air like a toxic fume refusing to dissipate. But the black man, sitting motionless at the very center, did not need to lift a finger to quiet the room. Just one gaze from him, stretched out like a clock hand compressing time, was enough to make every wandering eye turn away, as if caught stealing something that was never there. Officers who had been chuckling seconds earlier suddenly straightened up, as though unconsciously corrected by a command that had never been spoken. There is a kind of silence that doesn't need to be imposed. It makes others shut up on their own, afraid their own superficiality might be exposed. The judge adjusted his posture, leaned his elbows on the bench, trying to regain the rhythm of a hearing slipping out of formal control. He looked down at the near-empty file, then back up at the defendant, voice dry but rushed. "Do you request a court-appointed attorney?" No movement came, except for a single, firm nod from the man. A nod to decline. No request, no need. The judge raised an eyebrow and repeated the question, this time for the record. "You confirm that you will represent yourself in this court?" The man spoke for the first time that day, voice deep, steady, not loud, not soft, without dramatics, yet strong enough to make the microphone hum with a strange vibration. "I will represent myself." Just 4 words, but the last syllable landed like the lid of a stone coffin. No one in the room said another word. At the rear left corner, a young court reporter was toying with her pen when it slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. The pen rolled a short distance and stopped right beneath the defendant's feet. She bent down to retrieve it. But when she looked up, she locked eyes with him. No threat, no tension, but in those eyes was a strange kind of light, like an upward beam from the depths of the ocean, cold, still, and so deep that anyone who looked into them felt themselves hollowed out. Her hand trembled for a split second before she forced a smile and turned away, but the imprint was left somewhere in her mind, like a cold touch, pressing through the thin skin of professional discipline. The judge tapped the microphone again, trying to steer the proceedings back into the procedural framework he had memorized over 30 years on the bench. "Do you have anything to present before the indictment is read?" The man turned his head, not slow, not rushed, his gaze no longer probing or defensive, but more like a lead bullet laid gently on the table for all to hear it fall. "No," one word. No tremble, no urgency, no evasion. Nothing. A total void, but not of someone who lacks words, rather of someone who no longer needs them. A negation through existence. A no that struck straight into the chests of those waiting for an outburst to break the tension. On the back bench, a law intern, blonde hair, white skin, held a notebook. At first, he had been writing fast, pen gliding across the page as if afraid to miss a detail. But ever since the man uttered no, his hand slowed, then halted, not for lack of data, but because something had occurred that could not be captured in legal language. After a long pause, he scribbled along the bottom margin, a crooked line with no punctuation, as if written from a place of doubt rather than certainty. "This is not a normal man." The sentence repeated itself in his mind, then slowly turned into a quiet declaration, not to condemn, not to defend, but simply to remember that sometimes someone can sit in the defendant's chair and make the entire courtroom feel lower than the chair he is seated in. No one in that room knew how to proceed. The remaining procedures, reading the indictment, presenting statements, and cross-examination, became empty shells when the central figure refused to play the game that had been set up. He did not reject the role, but neither did he perform it the way they expected, and that alone made the whole structure of a courtroom, built on the distribution of power, suddenly feel like a stage with no director. There is a kind of power that does not come from titles, ranks, or degrees, but from the ability to make others question their own roles. And he, simply by sitting still, saying nothing, asking no favors, made every person in that room feel redundant. Some glances began to flicker between one another, not out of suspicion, but confusion, when all the usual tactics, pressure, mockery, humiliation, were met with silence, people no longer knew what to do next. An officer who had previously swaggered now sat restlessly, checking his watch. A female clerk pretended to rummage through her bag to avoid the defendant's gaze, even though he wasn't looking at anyone. The judge paused his pen, rested his chin on one hand, as if pondering a chess game he couldn't recall when it began, and whether the man sitting silently across from him was playing black or white. No one was sure anymore. When the system is used to resist, it knows how to crush it. When it's used to rage, it knows how to suppress it. But when confronted with someone who doesn't need defending, doesn't speak, doesn't react in any of the ways the system can counter, it becomes lost. And that confusion was now spreading like static through all four walls. There were no screams, no punches, no evidence to contest, only a man sitting upright, like a sentence not yet underlined but already forcing everyone to read more carefully than the first time. The pen that had fallen earlier had been returned to the table, but the faint scratch on the floor where it hit still remained, a subtle reminder that some impacts, though small, leave lasting marks. And with the man's final glance, as the judge exhaled gently, preparing to move to the next section, everyone in the room understood one thing. He did not need to speak, because from this moment forward, everyone else would have to speak about themselves. The hearing was not over, but the position of who was truly on trial had begun to shift. Silence, once again, became the heaviest gavel in a room already burdened with too many wasted words. The man remained seated, back straight, eyes forward, his posture unshaken, not even by half a vertebra. While the entire room began to stew in a strange kind of discomfort, it was precisely his silence that carved out a void, one that others quickly filled with smug satisfaction. And, right at that moment, a police officer stood up, holding a file as thin as the report card of a troubled student, cleared his throat loudly. "I'd like to reread the defendant's personal record, just to make things clearer." No one objected. A few even nodded in agreement. He glanced sideways at the defendant, then began to read, his tone long-winded and dripping with sarcasm. No occupation, no education, no fixed address. What a model citizen. Laughter broke out again. Not in unison, but enough to make the room feel like it had been splashed with filthy water, and yet no one bothered to wipe their faces. From the audience benches, a group of law students, faces still youthful, but eyes already steeped in the arrogance of fresh graduates, burst into laughter. One of them, hair bleached platinum gray, slapped his thigh 3 times and shouted, "Who invited the clown to court? Is this a courtroom or an acting class?" Nods followed. Laughter rolled like steel balls across marble. Even the court reporter winced, not because it was funny, but because she realized she was sitting among people who didn't need to study law to understand that they had already crossed the bare minimum boundary of decency. A middle-aged man sat in the back row, modest in appearance but with a crisply ironed shirt and old glasses resting on the bridge of his nose. He turned to the students and said in a voice hoarse from anger, "Do you think this is a joke? What you're laughing at is the right to exist." The air froze for a beat, but just one. Immediately, a police officer moved in, no questions asked, no clarification needed, and signaled, "Please leave. You're disturbing public order." The man removed his glasses, looked at them, and stood up slowly. He did not resist, but the look he left behind was a silent warning. In a place where reason drowns beneath laughter, it is one's character that washes away first. Not long after, a strange sound rang out from a corner of the room. At first, a low buzz. Then it turned into music. Someone was playing a TikTok video. The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakably clear on the screen. Footage of the defendant, edited, zoomed in, and looped, his entry into the courtroom, his expressionless eyes, all set to a popular parody track. The beat was light, the lyrics replaced with mocking lines. "Walking into court like it's a catwalk, silent like a dumb guy in shock, cold face like cash, but looks like a job interview flop." Laughter burst forth again, this time joined by whistles and soft applause, as if this hearing had indeed turned into a live comedy show. The man still said nothing, no reaction. He didn't pull out a phone, didn't turn his head, didn't shift his posture, but for a fleeting instant, a narrow glint sharp as a blade flashed across his eyes. Only the court reporter sitting nearby caught it. That glint didn't blaze or explode. It simply sliced through the air like metal grazing bare skin. It was enough to give someone nearby the chills down their spine, enough for the perceptive to realize that what was being mocked wasn't an individual, but the shape of an entire system, laughing into its own mirror. No one in that room, including the judge, had the courage to stop the music. No one asked for the clip to be turned off. No one asked who played it. And it was this silence, amplified by the laughter, that became an invisible pact, permitting contempt to disguise itself as justice. The trial didn't need a verdict. The judgment had already been passed by the collective when they chose to play videos instead of listening, scroll TikTok instead of reading files, and laugh instead of understanding. And that, perhaps, was the most concentrated crime of the day. The scattered laughter still rippled through the air like an oil slick, yet to dry, when the courtroom door quietly opened once more. No sound, no signal. A woman stepped in. No one noticed her at first because there was nothing about her that drew the eye. Just a plain gray blouse, a skirt that fell past her knees, and a pair of beige flats with worn edges. Not the kind of person you'd see in a political drama or a heist, but the way she walked, silent, steady, unhurried, was like the ticking of a countdown clock, prompting a few heads to lift and watch. She didn't head toward the judge, nor did she veer left toward the police. She walked straight, like she'd been programmed, to the man sitting motionless in the defendant's chair. In her hand was a white envelope. No seal, no ink, no markings. A nearby security officer noticed the anomaly and stepped forward to block her path. She paused briefly, then reached into her inner pocket and pulled out a small card, raising it just to his eye level. Federal Liaison, 3 italicized words on a deep blue background. No one said a word. No one checked it. She proceeded forward, placed the envelope directly in front of the defendant, then turned and walked straight toward the door, which had already opened as if waiting for her. No one stopped her, and no one could recall how exactly she had left. The man looked at the envelope for a moment. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't reach for it immediately. His eyes showed no surprise, only a cold recognition, as if he'd known it would come and had been waiting for this exact moment. Finally, he picked it up, opened it, and pulled out a small piece of folded paper, its edges slightly frayed. On it, in black ink, there was a single handwritten line, "Prepare." No period, no signature, nothing more. But the man looked at those letters like a witness to the first flame of a new century. His lips tightened. His gaze shifted, not in color, but in depth, from patient to alert. An officer seated nearby caught a glimpse, shrugged, and scoffed. Let him daydream. He turned to his colleague, muttering with contempt, "These guys love the theatrics. Spy movie scraps of paper and all that." The colleague chuckled but said nothing, because in his own mind only one question circled: who authorized her to enter? But like the sigh from the man earlier escorted out of the courtroom, this question would find no answer. Or worse, someday, no one would dare answer it. Meanwhile, the defendant didn't move again. He folded the note, tucked it back into the envelope, and set it neatly on the table, like an official exhibit. No one was allowed to edit, and he returned to his previous posture, back straight, eyes forward, silent, as if the woman had never appeared. But for those who had seen, and truly seen, the surface of the water had just been touched. The waves had yet to show, but the stone had already sunk. The judge's expression suddenly changed. He seemed to sense a strange current slipping into the courtroom air, blurring the line between control and fracture. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice slower than usual, as if shaping each word carefully. "Can you state your previous occupation?" A prolonged silence followed, not from hesitation, but as if every syllable had to be weighed with precision before being spoken. The man lifted his head, looked straight ahead without flinching, and answered, "Former federal investigation work." No additional words were needed, no explanation, no specific title. But the whole room felt as if a crack had just spread across the worn-out wall of the courtroom. A young police officer let out a dry, involuntary laugh. "If you're FBI, then I'm the Bishop of the Vatican." His laugh was as brittle as scorched paper, sparking a few scattered chuckles behind him, but no one dared to laugh aloud, because that answer, just 4 simple words, was still echoing in the minds of those sharp enough to understand. Something was off. At the back of the room, a tech staffer received a request to retrieve the file. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard. The screen flickered, then displayed a pale red line, chilling despite its muted color. "Classified access denied." She frowned and tried again, using higher-level credentials. This time a warning sound played, followed by a repeated notice. "Classified data security code, code 40. Code." A man standing behind her, gray-haired, stepped forward slowly. He looked at the screen for a long moment, then muttered, "Why would there be a G44 code on a civilian file?" No one answered. No one was allowed to. In the world of classified documentation, G44 was not a security tier for local officials or common criminals. It was the clearance level reserved for files that should not exist, or that existed only because the nation needed to forget something too large to retain. But the man remained still. No pride, no provocation, no confirmation. His silence, this time, was no longer a wall of defense. It was a deliberate fracture running across the courtroom mural, a crack that didn't need to explode, but would spread through every tile, every glance, every question in the minds of all present. And in the middle of what had seemed like a mundane trial, the truth did not live in a plea. It lived in one answer no one dared believe, one line of data no one dared explain, and in one gaze that made the entire system suddenly feel hollow. The murmurs in the courtroom had not yet fully faded when the string of access code digits on the system screen abruptly changed color, from green to amber, then bright red. A short beep sounded, not loud, but solid, like a lock snapping shut from the inside. The technician, just about to input another query to retrieve the file, watched the screen go black, then refresh, this time showing only one frozen line of text, cold as ice. "Your account has been locked due to unauthorized access to red priority data sector." She had no time to grasp what had just happened when the system window slammed shut and the main screen flashed a final message. "Access revoked. Temporarily dropped." She sat still, hand still on the mouse, but her index finger began to tremble, as if a low current was pulsing beneath her skin. A passing staffer was about to tease, "What's the verdict? Did you crack the FBI files yet?" But as soon as he saw the screen, his expression shifted. He stepped closer, no longer smiling, and quickly scanned the final system note visible only to high-level personnel. "Do not touch, red priority. No permissions, no duplicates." The text was written in full uppercase, like blades slashing across what had seemed a calm surface. No one asked why. But everyone knew anything labeled red priority was something the system itself dared not joke with. The technician made a move to stand, but the system inbox blinked. An internal email had arrived from a Washington identifier. No subject, no signature, no attachment, just 7 words. "Maintain current state. Do not ask. Don't." No one knew who sent it, but the domain was government.gov with an internal verification string that could not be forged. No one in the IT room dared touch another line of code. The room went still. The young woman placed her hand back on the mouse, then withdrew it, as if she had accidentally touched something alive. The screen powered down after 20 seconds. Everything returned to black. But black was no longer just a screen background. It had become the silent space of suspicion. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, a figure appeared at the far door. No knock, no announcement, no name called. The state chief of police. He was not in uniform as usual, but in a charcoal gray suit with a high-boppered collar. Following behind him were two men in black suits, close-cropped hair, wearing sunglasses indoors as if the human light here was too harsh for eyes trained to scan in the dark. None of the three spoke. Their presence was the silent declaration. Something was now moving beyond the administrative scope of this courtroom. The judge stood up instantly. No time for introductions. He did not offer greetings, did not invite them to sit, just nodded slightly, but urgently. The police chief walked slowly to the center of the courtroom. No one dared utter a word. A few of the law students who had been giggling earlier now sat like statues, lips clenched by instinct. One officer started to approach for an explanation, but the moment he caught the eyes of the man on the right, he froze mid-step. No footstep rang out too loudly, yet every movement from those three men carried a gravitational pull, compressing the language itself. When they neared the defendant's bench, the man sitting there did not turn, did not change expression. They stopped directly behind him. No one touched his shoulder, no one whispered in his ear. But one of the two men pulled out a thin object from inside his jacket, unclear whether it was a badge, a summons, or a token. He held it in his hand for 3 seconds, just long enough to require no confirmation. The police officer standing nearby, the one who had laughed the loudest when the TikTok clip was played, took a step back and mumbled, "What the hell is going on?" No one answered, and that was the scariest part, because in a room that had earlier rattled with laughter, there now sat a silence so thick that even the sound of someone swallowing rang out like warning shots at a military base. One judge, one police chief, two unnamed agents, all present, yet none declared anything, because sometimes presence itself is the sentence, and silence is the siren of a system warning itself. On the defendant's bench, the man still sat straight, as if he were a question mark left unopened, already rendering the answers around him meaningless. And just at that moment, in a data center dozens of miles away, a system administrator reached for the phone to call his supervisor, but on the other end, a deep male voice cut in on the second word. "I know what you're about to ask. Don't. If you open any other files linked to code G44, your region-level access will be revoked within 60 seconds. Then the line went dead. No goodbye, no callback. Somewhere between the world of administration and the shadows of authority, a hair-thin boundary had just been severed, and when that thread fell, no one could say for sure anymore what was law, what was order, what was secrecy, and what exactly was watching them from behind those silent eyes. The footsteps of the two men in black suits still echoed faintly in the courtroom, like a lingering aftershock. But outside, the online world had already rewritten the entire trial in its own way, shortened, chopped up, absurd, and as easy to consume as a fast food meal. A TikTok video mocking the black man, with the title, "Silent Thug Where's He From For Real?" surpassed 1 million views in less than 12 hours. His image was zoomed in, played in slow motion, overlaid with sarcastic rap music, and a bright red clown face filter. The laughter from the courtroom, once real, was now looped into a background sound effect, followed by hundreds of thousands of rolling laugh emoji reactions. Beneath the video lay a jungle of comments, but the top one, pinned by the very account that posted it, read, "Definitely guilty. You can tell just by looking at him." Nearly 40,000 likes. One person added, "I don't trust anyone who shows up to court and says nothing. Only the guilty stay that quiet." Another piled on with a meme, a photoshopped image of him next to a supervillain from a superhero movie, captioned, "Society's enemy. Silent because he knows the law won't save him." None of them had been at the trial. None had seen the glance that made even the police chief take a step back. None had smelled the thick air that had spread across the room like a gas leak, colorless, odorless, but more dangerous than any verdict. To them, this was just an ideal social media script. A quiet black man, ridiculed, turned into a meme, and that was enough. But amid the hundreds of thousands of interactions, one comment appeared. Not many likes, no verified badge, but still enough to make some people stop scrolling. Just a single line. You just shot into the dark. No hashtags, no emojis, no explanation. Below it, 3 dots appeared as if the user intended to write more, then vanished. Nothing else. The account was set to private. No avatar, no bio, no post history. Yet it appeared at exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. And for those who had ever brushed against the underground intelligence network, those 3 words weren't a warning. They were a prelude. A few recognized the sign and immediately went silent. A group of Reddit forum admins began analyzing. The phrase might be connected to Operation G44's classification protocol. The 3-dot encryption was used in sealed federal files. That post was deleted within 15 minutes, no explanation given. The poster lost access. The community didn't care. The crowd kept sharing the latest remix of the mocking video, this time with added sneeze sounds and a boom headshot effect each time the camera panned to the defendant's face. In a conference room on the other side of the city, a communications director from a government agency was watching that same clip for the 30th time. He wasn't laughing, nor was he angry. He simply placed his hand on the keyboard and typed in a single access code, a request to enter the restricted data layer. The result, access denied. Operation Protocol G44 still active. He stood up and left the room, leaving behind the screen looping the TikTok video, muted but with the man's eyes still staring straight ahead, as if through every audience member typing behind their screens. None of them knew that, with every meme shared, they were reinforcing a fictional narrative and exposing themselves to those who don't play on social media but know every action, every link, every scent of bias. Every laugh they released was recorded, not for rebuttal, but for the moment they would be needed as testimony. At the headquarters of a major social media platform, an AI supervision engineer noticed a strange pattern of interaction around the hashtag #SilentThug. The access data came from IP addresses encrypted at military-grade levels, but they targeted only one content cluster, videos mocking the man from the trial. A report was filed. No one responded. Meanwhile, the man the center of the circus remains still, unaware or aware, but indifferent. Because for someone who once ran entire investigative operations from the shadows, the crowd is not a thing to argue with. It is a data set to be analyzed, and when the time comes, the crowd will be used as evidence. Social media laughs, but the real man does not, because some smiles don't live on the surface, they live inside the plot. And some people are not here to be understood, but to press a button. Those 3 dots are gone, but they were never erased. They are simply waiting for the right moment to become the period that ends the sentence. And then, just when the system thought it still had everything under control, the call came. No warning, no repeat. An old landline phone in the Judicial Coordination Room suddenly buzzed, not with a ringtone, but a dry, singular click in the air, like the sound of a safety being released on a loaded weapon. The duty officer that day, a woman in her early 40s who had served through 3 presidential terms, glanced at the screen. The only thing displayed, classified, secure line. No area code, no internal prefix, no extra characters. She picked up. No throat clearing, no greeting. 1 second later, a male voice came through, neither high nor low, neither fast nor slow, but every word sounded as if it had been programmed to go straight into the listener's spinal cord. Maintain the personnel status of the defendant. No sentencing, no transfer, no judgment. 6 commands, 13 words. No explanation needed, no questions asked. Before she could reply, the call was cut. No disconnect tone. Just a silent line, as if the entire room had been drained of sound. She set the receiver down on the desk. Her hand trembled slightly, not out of fear, but because she knew exactly what had just happened. A level of power her entire career had never touched had just placed its hand on the outcome of this trial and cloaked it in a shadow that no light was allowed to penetrate. Immediately, she relayed the message to the Internal Security Coordination Office. The police chief received the first fax. After reading it, he said nothing, but a few beads of sweat began to seep through his collar, even though the room temperature was below 20 degrees Celsius. He set the fax down, then turned to his longtime aide and whispered, "Who exactly are we trying?" The aide looked up, instinctively ready to answer as a matter of protocol, but suddenly realized he had not a single piece of information with which to define the man sitting in the defendant's chair. All he could do was lower his head in silence. Across the room, the elderly judge, once a symbol of state justice, pulled out his personal phone and stepped into the private chamber behind the bench. The door closed behind him. He dialed an internal number, a secure line reserved only for extraordinary circumstances. His legal assistant picked up. The judge's voice was low, unhurried but heavy with pressure. "Let me ask plainly, are we in the middle of a federal ethics test?" The line went silent, not because there was no answer, but because any answer at that moment would have been wrong. A beat later, the call disconnected. No one hung up, but the signal had been cut off from a level above. No one in the courtroom knew exactly what was happening, but they all felt one thing clearly. They were no longer in control. They who were used to giving orders, issuing judgments, and maintaining control were now pawns on a chessboard they had never seen from above. And that man, one who offered no defense, no reaction, no need for allies, was still sitting there, as if witnessing a simulation that did not belong to his world, but was unfolding exactly as written in a script he had read long ago. No one dared touch his file again. No one mentioned the document labeled preparation. No one repeated the code name G44. Every question now running through their minds was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was, what had they done? What had they said? How had they handled him? And were all of those moments being recorded, not by a camera, but by eyes watching from a place they had never been allowed to look up to? Outside the courtroom, on the top floor of a nameless building, a team of analysts was monitoring every reaction inside the courtroom. No discussion, no analysis. They simply flagged. Physiological responses, heart rate deviation, changes in body language, eye movement, everything was labeled like a pilot test. One member of the team tapped the table 3 times. The room froze. On the large screen, the defendant's face appeared. No description, no name. Only a single identifier, TIER0, and that was enough for the entire system. From the small courtroom to the top secret surveillance center, to understand there are people who don't need power to wield it. There are sentences that don't need to be spoken to be enforced. And there are calls, just one, but their echo will never leave the memory of those who once heard them. No one in the courtroom knew that they were caught inside a test that had already been triggered. There was no alarm bell. No one stood up to declare this a purge. There was only silence, tightening like a vice, each passing minute carrying an invisible pressure that made those who once shouted now twitch with irritation, itchy in the very uniforms that had once made them feel powerful. The impatience did not stem from reason, but from the unease of facing someone who refused to speak, who did not react, who denied them the very things they needed to feel in control. And then, as if by reflex, a dangerous instinct this system had trained into them, a group of officers stepped forward. As the officers advanced a single step, their black gloves tightened, the thuds of their boots echoed against the cold tile floor, reverberating through the breathless courtroom. They were far too familiar with the act of forced compliance, too used to the silent nods of approval from superiors who pretended not to see. The defendant remained seated on the wooden bench, uncuffed, unresisting, yet his very presence made the air grow thick and heavy. One officer squinted, casting a contemptuous glance, his voice dry and grating. "Stand up. Don't make us lay hands on you." No one stopped him. No attorney objected. No judge spoke. The courtroom, which was meant to be the heart of justice, had become a deep pit overflowing with arrogance, bias, and blatant disdain. The black man remained silent, like a stone detached from the world. But the moment the officer's hand reached for his shoulder, a soft click sounded, not sharp, not loud, but it split the room in two. He opened the black briefcase beneath his feet, his movements slow, unhurried. No one reacted. Not out of respect, but out of confusion. A gleaming piece of metal was drawn out, precise, pristine, free of dust, flawless. An official badge, silver-rimmed, with a dark blue background and an eagle insignia, undeniably authentic. This was not the kind of fake paper threat they were used to seeing in petty court stunts. No one said a word, because the name on that badge was Elijah Ford, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The room was plunged into a chilling silence. A name that had no business appearing here. A title that could never belong in the defendant's chair. A man whom the entire system had believed to be a nobody, now revealed to be the one standing at the very top of the system they serve. A plainclothes agent, who had sat silently among the spectators like any other attendee, suddenly stood, not in shock, but to bow. No hesitation, no pretense, no camouflage. A deep, deliberate bow, as if before a 3-star general in the middle of a battlefield. No one dared speak. No officer retained the arrogance they'd flaunted just moments earlier. Those who had mocked, laughed, and jeered during the earlier proceedings were now frozen shadows of fear. A single click had brought their pompous world crashing down. A single name made them realize they had ridiculed the wrong man. Not just an ordinary citizen, but someone who could authorize an investigation into their entire agency with a single phone call. No one sat still, but no one moved either. Not a soul in the legal establishment had the confidence to utter any argument in defense of what they had just done. Silence wrapped the courtroom like a thick layer of ice. So cold, no one dared to breathe too hard. Elijah Ford still did not stand. He simply looked around the room, his gaze not angry, not vengeful, not forgiving, just empty and ruthlessly quiet. Then, as if concluding a sentence they themselves had written, he spoke a single line. "You should have stayed as silent as I did." It wasn't a grand statement, not a call for justice, not a declaration of truth. It was a blade cutting straight into the core of guilt in everyone present. Because everyone understood. His silence had been a mirror. Silence, not because he was weak, but because he had waited to see how this system would expose itself in the face of someone unreadable, unleadable, and unwilling to say a word. Someone dropped a pen. Someone pulled out a phone to try and record the scene, but their trembling hand couldn't press the record button. A judge slumped over the bench, lips cracked and dry, muttering under his breath as if hypnotized. No way, no way. An officer stood frozen, sweat trailing down his neck, legs wobbling like he had just awoken from a nightmare. Every action, every mocking word they had spoken earlier now returned like lashes on their pride, their careers, and their political lives. The courtroom doors remained open, but no one walked out, because they understood. It was not Ford who had been on trial. They were the ones who had just revealed their true nature under a spotlight they could not control. No one dared draw a weapon. No one shouted. Not a single apology was spoken, because they knew every word now would be cheap deceit in front of the man they had once looked at like garbage, and who now shook the very pillars of their legal system. The jokes, the mocking TikToks, the laughter that had echoed through previous sessions were now indelible stains that could not be washed away, and the only one still seated there, posture unchanged, not yelling, not defending himself, was Elijah Ford, the one who had stayed silent, observed, let them reveal themselves, then, with a single motion, a badge, a sentence, obliterated the illusion of power they had clung to for so long. The air froze. The entire room sat beneath the pale glare of overhead lights that felt as cold as steel. No one dared leave their seat, not because they were forbidden, but because Ford's presence was now like a mirror. No reflection was needed to see their real faces, and they knew, if they stood, if they walked out, they would carry forever the shame of having been turned into a joke in a game they never knew they were a part of. Ford was no victim. He wasn't a hero either. He was simply the only one who knew how to remain silent, long enough for the vultures to tear each other apart before realizing the prey was their own grotesque egos. And in a world where truth is twisted by laughter and prejudice, a man silent long enough, deep enough, can collapse an entire system without lifting a hand. The aftershock of the sentence, "You should have stayed, as silent as I did," still hung in the air, a low, muffled echo, seeping through every crack in a power structure once believed to be untouchable. The black man left the courtroom, not under escort but on his own feet, like someone holding absolute initiative, without turning back, without casting a single glance at the faces now sweating under the weight of their own disdain. But the moment the door closed behind him, what truly mattered had only just begun to open. Nearly 1,200 kilometers away, the J. Edgar Hoover Building stood like a block of concrete, pulsing in the heart of Washington, D.C., lights glowing through the night. No alarms, no sirens, just steady footsteps, a cascade of internal calls, and unblinking eyes fixed on a data board as it populated line by line. The first line, typed in a plain, unadorned font, re-evaluation order. All state law enforcement agencies, immediate, no exclamation point, no emergency label, but in the world of absolute administrative authority, silence is the most terrifying weapon. An emergency meeting had been summoned. No advance notice, no option to decline. Senior FBI officials sat in long rows, no one speaking, no one flipping through files. On the large screen at the front of the room, footage from the morning's trial in that distant state, replayed, uncut, unedited. Every expression, every smirk from the local police blown up like raw evidence. At 4:13 in the morning, a summons was dispatched through the federal government's encrypted network. The recipient, the state's chief of police, where the trial had taken place. A man once considered a regional power figure, known for saying, "We run this state. We don't answer to Washington." But now he could only stand motionless in front of the screen, eyes widened as the message appeared, "Required to report to FBI headquarters. No delay permitted. No legal counsel allowed." The words cut through pride like steel. No one asked for justification. It was enough to know that the man who appeared in court yesterday was not someone. He was the person who could question and erase anyone in this system. Elsewhere in the same state, at the operations center of the local police department, the surveillance system flickered. Within 7 minutes, full control of the system was transferred, no notification, no authentication code required from upper management. A team of technicians in black uniforms, no name tags, appeared before dawn like ghosts. They asked no one, showed no credentials. They simply scanned a QR code on their devices, and the system immediately displayed Authorized FBI Oversight Commission. The IT staff could only glance at one another, no one daring to intervene. Hard drives containing internal personnel records, body cam footage, and personal communications, each one sealed, one by one. The intranet went completely dark. All access privileges were rerouted to a single destination, FBI headquarters. What the police once considered their turf, within mere hours, had become forbidden ground. No press conferences were held, no official statements released, but internally, every mid-level commander received a private notice. All documents under local police jurisdiction are temporarily revoked. Reason: federal investigation interference. No one understood the full picture, but everyone knew this. Anyone who questioned it would be flagged. No threats needed. No guns drawn. Just one code appearing in the system was enough to make an entire precinct fall silent. The chief of police, once seated at the highest table during the ceremonies, could no longer access his own office. His keycard was deactivated. His computer screen was locked by a top-tier clearance code. He shouted at a security guard, "I'm the one in charge here." But the guard, eyes down, repeated a mechanical line. "We're following directive orders." The bitterness didn't stem from the loss of power, but from the realization that no one cared to hear him anymore, not a single person, because the very thing they had mocked in court yesterday was now the force behind every decision, every access command, every system override they once believed belonged to them. In the shadows of the command center, an FBI agent monitored the access activity chart. Thousands of officer accounts disconnected. No more editing rights, no backups. Not even internal emails could be opened. A glowing red banner stretched across every interface. System frozen, not by federal sailors. Retaliation did not come by bullets, but by decree. Not by blood, but by jurisdiction. And that level of order made it far more terrifying than any uprising. Above, in Washington, the list of agencies placed under reevaluation continued to grow. Each new name added rang like a bell tolling the death of credibility. Data files were re-encrypted and tagged. Priority review, 5 Elijah Ford. No one dared say that name out loud, but everyone understood. The man rewriting the rules was the same one who had sat still, voiceless, while others laughed. And now he was speaking, not with words, but with the full force of a system in motion. On paper, no one was arrested. No one was fired. Not a single bullet was fired. But for those who once believed power was permanent, each office light turned off was a sign in itself. The age of untouchability had ended. And the tsunami was not a bang, but a violent tide washing away every rotten shred of self-importance, leaving behind no screams, only the dead silence inside those who once believed, "I am the law here." The next morning did not begin with sunlight, but with suspension notices. No sirens, no thunder, just lines of text, cold as steel, printed and neatly placed on the desks of every officer who had slapped their thighs and laughed in court the day before. The wall of honor they once leaned on like a solid foundation had suddenly rotted and collapsed without making a sound. All that remained were ashen faces, eyes too ashamed to meet their own reflections, because what they saw now was what society had begun to call by only 3 words: "You've been exposed." No one screamed, no one resisted. Only the morning wind blew through the hallways of the police station, where there were no longer the firm footsteps of authority, but only the dragging steps of those who had lost everything and didn't know where to begin retrieving it. Those who once chuckled when a young boy asked, "Is he a bad guy?" were now trembling, gripping the suspension letters, gasping through an unnamed shame. An older officer, who had once led the escort team, returned home and met the disappointed eyes of his own wife. She said nothing, only looked at him, shook her head, and sighed, as though she had just witnessed the death of a man who no longer held value. "Who was he?" asked their 15-year-old daughter, still holding the phone, playing a grainy video clip recorded secretly in the courtroom. The image was blurry, but the voice was crystal clear. "You should have stayed as silent as I did." The officer reached to snatch the phone, but the daughter pulled away, her eyes like ice. "How stupid can you be? Do you even know who he is?" Her words cut deeper than any disciplinary order. It was a sentence handed down in blood, unappealable, without the right to appeal. His face sagged, hands limp at his sides. He had spent a lifetime silencing others with guns and batons, and now he was slapped by his own family with a truth he could not deny. On television, the morning news skipped not a single second of the trial. The headlines needed no sensationalism because the truth alone was enough to strangle the public's throat. FBI director tried like a common black man. Justice keeper humiliated by those representing the law. We laughed, and now we pay. The ticker at the bottom of the screen ran on loop, not to report, but to repeat. To press down on the wound that society needed to remember. A clip from a leaked recording inside the police department showed a young officer chewing gum, laughing, as he watched a TikTok mocking the defendant, complete with sarcastic music. His voice rang out like a second blade. "This morning's show was gold. Classic black drama queen stuff." The clip ended with the entire room bursting into laughter. The online community poured fuel on the fire. Forums flooded with screenshots, video snippets, and captions more scathing than any indictment ever written. "Still laughing? You know now who you messed with?" One tweet was retweeted more than 600,000 times within 4 hours. News outlets began digging into the records of every officer who had appeared in the footage. Every name, every title laid bare. But no one responded. Not because they felt guilty, but because they knew any explanation now would only feed the flames. A young officer, baby-faced, sat in his bathroom, head buried in his hands, phone on the floor, the screen still lit, showing the clip he had once proudly shared. Elijah Ford, being treated like a thug. Now, his own face flooded the headlines, the loudest laugher, and the hardest fall. The FBI didn't need to knock on his door. No arrest warrant was necessary, just the glance of a stranger recognizing him, just the look in his mother's eyes, seeing her son's face on TV, not for valor, but for disgrace. Society doesn't need guns to destroy a man. Public opinion alone is enough to bring down an entire system. The only one who said nothing, who made no rebuttal, who issued no statement, was still Elijah Ford. He did not appear on television. He gave no speech. He wrote no blog. He answered no interviews, but his absence made everything heavier, as if each minute he did not appear added another ton of weight onto the shoulders of those who once disrespected him. And the cruelest part was this: he did not need to do anything more, because the entire system was crumbling under the weight of its own actions, it once dismissed as just a joke. In another city, a law student sat in class, her eyes contemplative, as the professor rewound the clip for a lesson on legal ethics. "I've seen him before," she said softly. I laughed. The professor did not scold her. He simply let the video play until the exact moment an officer shouted, "If you're FBI, then I'm the Pope," and paused on Ford's face. Eyes not angry, not defensive, just icy calm. The room went completely silent. Not out of fear, but out of realization they had once been the audience to a comedy, and only when the curtain fell did they see they were the clowns. Elijah Ford's silence was a funeral trumpet for a generation lazy with thought, a generation that believed power came with laughter and that mockery was a right. But a single name, a single title, a single badge revealed at the right moment had shattered that illusion into irretrievable shards. And once honor has been ground beneath the heels of truth, the FBI does not need to lift a finger. No one needs to draw a weapon. Society will take care of the rest, quietly, but without mercy. Television continued airing reports about the case that many thought had come to an end, but Elijah Ford's silence was not a conclusion. It was merely the intermission before the curtain was pulled back from the shadows backstage. While the public was still savoring the bitter aftertaste of mockery that had flipped the roles, in a small apartment far from D.C., an independent investigative journalist opened a laptop encrypted with 3 layers of security. The screen displayed the final code decrypted that morning, a string of internal data links that only those who had once infiltrated federal intelligence systems would know how to read. Her name was Livia Chen, not affiliated with any major media outlet, no studio, no crew. She was the kind of journalist despised by colleagues and officials alike because she did not follow orders, refused to compromise, and never asked permission before exposing the truth. And this time, what she had uncovered was not merely a file, it was the entire machinery behind the name Elijah Ford, a force that made the whole system tremble, yet dared not name him. The first line in the file was titled, "Interlock 0, Do Not Smite. Elijah Ford, former commander of the highest-level internal purification unit of the FBI for 12 years. More specifically, he led the team investigating misconduct, violence, and corruption committed by federal agents and local police, a group whispered within the profession as the blade hidden in the sleeve." But what left Livia speechless was not the role itself. It was the fact that Ford's current official title was Executive Director, Federal Internal Affairs Investigation Oversight Division, a position never disclosed to the public, never recorded in any document or organizational chart, an invisible name overseeing a covert surveillance network with authority that surpassed even the constitutional limits. He opened the second attachment. Its title simple yet formidable: Direct Oversight Reports, Classified, Tier 1 Security Clearance Required. Inside were confidential reports, passed through no filter, submitted only to a select group at the national executive level. Each report was a name, an agency, a documented violation with evidence, images, testimonies, and internal recordings. Some police departments were functioning as usual, but were in fact under secret investigation. Some officers were still waving to the press, while in Ford's reports they were marked as Active Surveillance Level 3. Livia scrolled to the final page of one dossier and saw 3 words stamped in bright red: Ongoing Operation. Beneath it, a note read, Allow subject to engage, no interference, record natural behavior in an uncontrolled environment. She needed no further explanation. It confirmed what the entire nation had just witnessed. The courtroom trial was not a miscarriage of justice. It was a nationwide ethical experiment, prearranged, remotely monitored, flawlessly executed. A performance where the audience did not know they were actors, and the lead had never needed a single line. Just a few hours after Livia released the first set of data, major media outlets began to pick up the scent. It could not be ignored, could not be unseen. CNN opened its segment with the headline, America's moral gatekeeper has spoken. NBC posed a blunt question live: if he's the one on trial, then who is truly being judged? But the most piercing remark came from a late-night current affairs show. Elijah Ford was not humiliated. He let them humiliate themselves. And now the entire nation must ask, will we treat the truth as a trial or avoid it like a crime? Inside law enforcement headquarters, those who had laughed and passed judgment now dared not speak openly. Each time Ford's name appeared on screen, it made their stomachs twist, as if clenched in a fist, because they knew he was not merely a director. He was the architect of the surveillance system that was now consuming them. No one could pick up the phone and ask directly. No hotline for complaints. No official memo. Only silence, tightening like a vice. One turn each day, until arrogant masks shattered without leaving a trace. At a small law enforcement reform summit in Texas, a seasoned senator stood at the podium, voice gravelly but weighted. We don't need a giant mirror to see ourselves. We only need someone silent long enough to hear us reveal who we truly are. And as the entire room fell silent, he continued, I'm not afraid of a man like Elijah Ford. I'm afraid that we need a man like him to realize we're wrong. International outlets soon joined the fray. BBC wrote, the greatest moral experiment in modern American history. Der Spiegel called it a trial where the accused measures the entire society. Al Jazeera, more scathing, stated, when blackness is no longer a reason for disdain, America must confront a question. How long have we been living in the illusion of justice? For Elijah Ford, true identity needed no formal statement. It was revealed through the consequences his silence left behind. No speeches, no grand press conference, but each leaked document sliced into a system decaying from complacency. And when society begins to ask moral questions, the answer never lies with the one who asks. It lies in the reaction of those being watched, those unaware they have just become led characters in a test the entire nation must now face. They say when the truth is laid bare, it creates 2 types of people, those who fall silent to learn, and those who fall silent because they have nothing left to say. After Elijah Ford's true identity was exposed, after the nation was flooded with headlines, tweets, and unofficial confessions veiled under the phrase, we didn't know, somewhere else, far from the news, apart from public discourse, a small classroom inside the FBI Academy at Quantico began its morning lecture with a single video, a trial without a verdict. The room was so quiet that the first sound from the video clip blared like an alarm. No dramatic lighting, no effects, just the image of a black man sitting still in the middle of a courtroom, silent, like a lone milestone in a forsaken land. The young cadets stared at the screen, none of them laughing, not because they knew the ending, but because they were now watching with the eyes of someone who understood. They could have been part of that courtroom, not as the defendant, but as the observer, or worse, the one who laughed. The instructor gave no lecture. He simply stepped back toward the board, arms folded, and let the footage roll through its key moments. Ford's eyes as he was questioned, the burst of laughter from the officers, the sneering lips of the law students seated in the back row, and finally, the unspoken turning point, the FBI badge drawn from his bag, the one line of dialogue that choked the room. No one paused the clip. No one pulled out a phone. When the video ended, the room remained frozen, as if carved in stone. A cadet sitting in the third row hesitantly spoke, his voice carrying the haze of someone who hadn't fully grasped it all but felt something enormous had just occurred. Why didn't he speak up from the beginning? The question echoed in the room like a disguised confession. The instructor stepped toward the podium, his hands still clasped behind his back, eyes fixed not just on the cadet but on the whole class. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't preach. He simply spoke, softly, like dropping a stone into a still lake, because your laughter was the one thing he needed to see most clearly. No one dared ask another question, not out of fear, but because they all understood. Laughter is the easiest response when we do not understand, do not care, or do not believe someone could be greater than us. But that very laughter had become evidence that required no cross-examination, no witnesses, and no statute. Ford didn't need anyone to take his side, because he wasn't trying to win an argument. He only needed them to reveal their true selves, and they did, without missing a detail. On the screen behind him, the instructor displayed the final slide, white letters on a black background. Justice isn't what you say, it's what you reveal. No one needed a translation. No one needed to take notes. Each word stamped itself into memory, not as a training slogan, but as an epitaph for the honor of anyone who had ever underestimated the weight of silence. The class ended, but no one stood up right away. A cadet in the back row, eyes red, clenched her pen so tightly that it snapped. She whispered to the person beside her, "I once shared that parody clip in our school's private group." No one scolded her. No one reacted, because there were no words left powerful enough to wash away the feeling of recognizing yourself in that video, not in the image, but in the posture, in the look that once allowed you to laugh before you understood the whole picture. The instructor walked out of the room without looking back, but in his eyes was something no one could deny, the hope that this shame would be deep enough to ensure that the next generation, when they finally wore the badge, would understand it is not the ID card that grants the right to judge others, but their own attitude that will be judged first, silently, invisibly, and sometimes by the very person they once deemed beneath them. At the administrative office, a notice was quietly pinned to the bulletin board. No bold headline, no red warning, just a simple line, starting next week. All cadets are required to review the courtroom footage of Elijah Ford as foundational material in the course Law Enforcement Ethics. Beneath it was a note. No discussion needed, just remember. A long hallway leading to the lecture rooms now echoed like a cemetery in the place once filled with the laughter of future officers. Only the sound of heavy footsteps remained, weighted with a dignity never taught in textbooks, but just hammered into the heart by a video less than 10 minutes long. There was no hero in this story. Elijah Ford never needed that title. He did not seek praise nor act to earn gratitude, but the way he remained silent, the way he let an entire generation display its true face, was what made every cadet in that room realize justice is not forged by those who speak the loudest, but by those who are brave enough to stay silent at the right moment and let others expose themselves. In one corner of the Academy's honor display case, which holds images of former agents and the FBI's greatest accomplishments over nearly a century, someone quietly added a new frame. No portrait, no biography, just a grainy black and white image capturing the moment Elijah Ford raised his badge in the courtroom. Beneath it was a single line of small print, a man who once stayed silent so an entire nation could hear itself. Just 1 week after the lesson at the FBI Academy, America woke up to a slap that came from no one but the bold black letters splashed across the crisp white pages of major newspapers nationwide. The dirtiest trial of the year, and the victim was the FBI director. No need for explanation. No need for an additional line of description. The headline alone was enough to turn every administrative meeting room as silent as a morgue. That headline was not merely an insult. It was an indictment, printed with real ink, on real paper, distributed publicly, and impossible to deny. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic all ran the same title, unchanged, unedited. The draft had been approved in one go, and no one dared to touch the editor's words. These were newspapers that once balanced public opinion. Now they had become double-edged swords, protecting no one, saving no one, merely exposing the truth in the most blinding way possible. The mayor of the city where the trial took place called for an emergency meeting within less than 24 hours after publication. The room was packed, yet no one spoke. The air conditioner ran at full capacity, but couldn't dissipate the suffocating fog of dread. The mayor's face had gone pale as he stepped up to the podium, and without uttering a word, everyone already understood. His dream of a second term had died before he even pressed the elevator button to leave his office that morning. "I apologize to America," he said, voice rough like gravel in his throat. No applause, no response. That apology was not addressed to a person, it was meant for a nation that had just seen the true face of the government it had elected. On the same day, a federal political figure, not affiliated with the ruling party, not a member of any related committee, appeared on a nightly news show. The darkness behind the studio looked like a tombstone. He stared directly into the camera, no script, no teleprompter, spoke a single sentence, and left the broadcast, "I think we just took a test and failed." That line, like an unsigned verdict, spread through every screen like silent electromagnetic waves, shattering every excuse. The system needed no one to break it. It cracked on its own, like an old bridge hiding its fractures beneath paint. All it took was one rainstorm for the entire structure to reveal its gaping holes, now beyond repair. This time, the storm didn't come from a petty scandal. It came from a silent man, a presence strong enough to make a nation stop and examine itself, then ask, "How long have we lived inside an illusion we dressed up to look like justice?" Ford didn't need to say another word. His silence had become a new standard of power. Not the power to dominate, but the power to force an entire system to re-examine itself. And when politics could no longer salvage dignity, and media could no longer salvage image, there remained only one refuge: money. But this time, money turned its back too. The sponsors of the local police department's funding project, including major corporations, banks, and investment funds, quietly pulled out. No press conferences, no press releases, just halted funds. Stopped transfers. The headquarters upgrade was suspended indefinitely. Contracts for new equipment were canceled without explanation. One bank even requested to have its name removed from the list of sponsors for police-run community programs. No one wanted their name attached to what was now called the real face of America. On social media, the hashtag #WeFailedTaname trended within 2 hours. But no one tagged him. No one mentioned him by handle, because everyone knew Ford didn't play to the stage. He didn't need to trend. He didn't need gratitude. Those words, to him, were just belated echoes from a world that had once chosen to turn its back. Inside government offices, urgent emails went out with the chilling subject line, "Damage control." But no control was left effective when the entire moral wall had already cracked from within. Legislative aides dialed crisis consultants repeatedly, but no one was willing to take the case. No one wanted to touch a scandal where the truth was too clear, too deep, and beyond spin. The law schools, The weekly quiz was replaced by a single assignment: analyze the systemic failure in the trial of Elijah Ford and its legal and ethical consequences. The question didn't seek a right or wrong answer, it demanded confrontation, and not one student dared to turn in a half-hearted paper. In the meeting room of one of the most powerful law enforcement lobbying organizations, the quarterly budget chart was hastily erased, replaced by a blank slide and a single question from the council president. If the system has already lost him, then what exactly do we think we're holding on to? No one answered. No answer was needed, because by then, every name that once laughed, once denied, once mocked, Ford was now staring into the mirror. Not a mirror of appearance, but a mirror of ethics. The media didn't kill anyone. Politics didn't kill anyone. But when both and the money turned away at the same time, even the sturdiest system could collapse like a sandcastle. And this time, no one could rebuild the curtain, because the man who had once sat silently in that courtroom had never pulled it down. He had simply let it tear, slowly, quietly, by the very hands of those who thought they held the right to judge. The newspapers landed on the conference table, like stones dropping into a deep well. No one bothered to turn the page. The headline was enough. The words lashed across the foreheads of everyone in the room like a whip: the dirtiest trial of the year. And the victim was the FBI director. Washington no longer had room for unconscious silence. But in the deepest, soundproofed basement of the federal security headquarters, where the three most powerful agencies in America, DOJ, DHS, and FBI, sat at the same table, the only thing maintained with absolute certainty was this: deliberate silence. They sat, each facing a copy of the list of individuals who had been removed from the system without notification, without hearing, without a verdict, only through a command marked with a red Pirati code. Some names were familiar: people who had once spoken publicly about the fairness of modern trials at professional conferences, now appearing next to a cold annotation, non-operational, removed from data chain. One senior official who had mocked Ford at the courthouse gate for not wearing his agency badge now stared down at the printed page, where his own name had just been outlined in red marker by someone else's hand. There were no microphones, no audio recordings. All visual equipment had been disabled using presidential-level security protocols. The meeting was titled Interagency Briefing, National Morality Experiment Review, but everyone understood. No one was there to listen, they were there to confirm. The shadow had been unleashed, and no one was sure whether they were the next name in the trial list. The room had no windows, no natural light, only harsh white LED panels that turned every face pale, as if everyone there was living beneath the skin of a corpse not yet buried. A legal advisor from DHS was assigned to read aloud excerpts from Ford's internal report. His voice was dry, stopping precisely at the note, "A system is only fair when it reacts to the nakedness of itself." He then flipped to Appendix C, where an illegally leaked internal memo compared Ford to a guy playing cosplay as a secret agent. The annotation next to the index, leaked from DHS server, internal IP. The whole room turned to look at him. No one spoke, but in their eyes was a verdict yet to be spoken and a fate already decided. A technician from the FBI gasped as the security software flagged and blocked an unauthorized login attempt from an account previously belonging to a senior DOJ advisor, the same man who once declared on national television that silent man in the courtroom isn't worth America's attention. Now, his access had been frozen from all analytical systems. In the behavioral analysis report from the Cybersecurity Division, the conclusion was clear: subject non-compliant with moral response protocol, flagged for shadow tracking. A video was found in the cache of an old desktop, a clip once used by an employee as an example during a training session titled Handling Unpredictable Personnel. In it, Ford was compared to a fictional video game villain, with dubbed voice lines simulating things he never said. The clip bore an internal watermark, produced by a deputy FBI official, and publicly screened during a year-end sharing session. That person was now listed as restricted from federal data access pending verification. No one dared reopen the file, but no one needed to. It had already been extracted, archived, and placed in front of today's table, not to accuse, but to show how deeply the system had already exposed itself. A screen displayed a list with no official heading, only a small line at the top. Special review, authorized by executive order. Below it, a name too familiar to be ignored, Elijah Ford. No one read it aloud, but everyone read it, and everyone understood. This was no longer about an individual. This was the existence of a system beyond all systems, not demanding power, but quietly defining what power meant. Next to his name was a clean annotation, Tier 0 Oversight / Moral Test Unit / No Operational Limitations. The final phrase sucked all the oxygen from the room. No operational limitations, meaning no one could order a stop, no oversight mechanisms, no supervisory process. Elijah Ford was running a program outside every standardized framework, and now both the DOJ and DHS had only one role left: to passively watch how deeply they were being watched. A file folder passed hand to hand, so softly it made no sound, but inside was a list of individuals who had shown negative moral impact during the period Ford's testing protocol was active. Some names had been crossed out in black ink, meaning already been removed from the system. Others were circled in red, under strict observation. One of the names belonged to the person who personally denied Ford's request for an on-the-spot statement during the trial, citing non-compliance with verbal presentation regulations via eye contact. That person had laughed loudly in a staff meeting, telling colleagues, "If he wants to speak with his eyes, then I'll reply with a smirk." Now, behavior analysis revealed he exhibited one of the highest levels of physiological stress response when Ford's name was mentioned. An internal clip leaked from a legal symposium 2 years earlier showed a speaker using Ford's image, before his identity was revealed, to illustrate a talk titled "How to Spot Power Delusions in Law Enforcement." His image was slowed, overlaid with blur effects, and backed by mocking music. The whole auditorium laughed. That clip had once circulated internally as an educational meme, attached to presentation slides with the theme, "The Silent Ones Aren't to be Trusted." After the revelations, the speaker resigned. No resignation letter, no farewell. Only a single email was sent by the system to his personal inbox. "You are no longer required to return." A technical report from the Social Feedback Analytics Group stated that over 400,000 sarcastic posts about Ford had been shared across internal law enforcement social networks during the early testing phase. The most popular phrase, "This guy thinks he's a ghost," that phrase had been printed on coffee mugs, t-shirts, and even used as keyboard stickers in some local offices. Now, all that data was being reverse-matched by AI against administrative history to determine regional collective moral deviation levels. What was once a joke had become a metric for recruitment and internal personnel classification. In the conference room now, no one dared bring up the past, but everyone remembered. They remembered ignoring Ford when he was denied access at a security checkpoint because the scanner couldn't identify his biometric data. The security officer had said, "People who leave no trace aren't to be trusted." The next day, he retold it like a victory story that made the whole office laugh. Now, his trace data had been frozen under emergency protocol, meaning his entire record was under encrypted surveillance, not for immediate action, but for observation. A senior official from the Department of Justice, who once believed that no one held enough authority to cause him concern, pressed his hands against the table, eyes fixed on the projection screen, unable to conceal his bitter skepticism. Does he intend to continue testing us? The question was not posed to elicit an answer. It was a sigh encapsulated in words, released as a psychological trap to see who would be foolish enough to presume they could predict Elijah Ford's intent. No one responded. An FBI representative subtly twirled a pen in his hand, his deep, well-like eyes staring directly at the questioner, then gave a slight nod, neither in agreement nor dissent. That silence conveyed a message. If you're still asking that question, you haven't grasped when this game began. The meeting proceeded as if remotely controlled by the very person absent. The next slide displayed no text. It was merely a map of the United States, with states shaded in light red, unnamed. Yet, everyone present possessed enough intelligence to recognize these were locations with undisclosed misconduct records, places where Elijah Ford might have installed devices, embedded personnel, and was awaiting another laugh, a glance, a slight from the system to trigger the next moral verdict. In a southern state previously notorious for excessive force during protest management, a security technician had publicly shared a satirical recording mocking Ford, dubbing him the man who demands justice with a stare. That recording had once circulated internally as an immortal joke. Now, with that state highlighted in light red on the map, that very individual sat in the meeting room, sweat soaking his back, eyes glued to the map as if that colored dot was scorching his throat. Beside him, a supervisor whispered, "Laugh once, ruin a lifetime." A DHS assistant murmured to a colleague, "We have no response plan. All simulation models have collapsed." The other did not reply, but his complexion mirrored that of a terminal cancer patient receiving a prognosis with no treatment options, no reaction, because no one knew the limits. Elijah Ford had set no boundaries, and that was the true fear. People don't fear the powerful. They fear those powerful individuals who don't need to show it. And Ford was the unseen cold wind that tore through every political, legal, and ethical mask. In a digital archive accessed legally under special moral inspection provisions, Ford had requested the complete login history of surveillance cameras at county-level detention centers previously noted for exceeding interrogation limits. A senior manager had once laughed in Ford's face upon learning he was merely an observer. "This is the field, not an ethics class," he remarked during a brief meeting. Now, his name appeared on the under-silent audit list, meaning all his actions over the past 6 months were being analyzed by an AI system without his knowledge. An internal clip showing him slamming his hand on a table, yelling at a subordinate for not extracting police suppression footage of a black man swiftly enough, was now included in a training slide on deviant behavior within the very program Ford had once developed. A DOJ analyst had publicly mocked Ford in an internal network post, calling him the monk in a suit, juxtaposing his image with detective film characters to ridicule his cold and silent demeanor. The post had been reshared over 1,700 times within the officer training academies. Now, his account was flagged as temporarily closed for verification. When friends inquired, he merely shrugged, but his eyes betrayed panic. Each login attempt now required 3-step biometric verification, and at the final step, instead of the dashboard, only one line appeared: "You are under surveillance." In a corner of the room, the DHS administrative director gently flipped through a thick file sealed with a red stamp. Inside were handwritten notes, not by Elijah, but by those who had once reported directly to him, all sharing a common theme: don't ask why, observe, and withdraw when necessary. Ford had trained a generation of agents who didn't speak, only acted, who didn't complain, only gathered evidence. And now, as the entire nation trembled before a trial without legal conclusion, he simply chose not to appear. No statements, no responses. But it was his absence that resonated the loudest. No one banged the table. No one threw chairs. Yet, the entire meeting revolved around the absent figure, as if they were minor planets, being drawn into a black hole they dared not directly observe. Elijah Ford, the once silent defendant, had become the center of an interagency review that no one dared to name. A senior DOJ official, during a briefing less than a year ago, had applauded, while watching footage of Ford sitting silently, unresponsive. He loudly proclaimed, full of glee, "A guy like that, if he's a real agent, then the FBI should shut down." That statement was later used as the title for an internal analysis article on silent resistance syndrome. He had initiated budget cuts for the Internal Ethics Control Project, labeling it a power game for those obsessed with perfection. Now, he couldn't take his eyes off the slide displaying Ford's name, not out of respect, but out of fear that looking away might cause him to miss a signal indicating he had been marked. Another internal report was presented, accompanied by video from a seminar where Ford had once attended as a silent guest. While he stood quietly in the hallway, uninvited into the meeting room, a group of young officers took the opportunity to mock him by pretending to trip in front of him, implying he was a jinx, destabilizing the system. One member of that group later suffered a data breach. All personal emails, access logs, and official communication histories were retrieved without explanation. The others didn't inquire, but all deleted photos, clips, and messages. That fear didn't stem from Ford. It arose from the realization that actions once deemed harmless jokes had become living evidence in a trial where the defendant need not appear. Someone in the meeting attempted to regain control, speaking almost in desperation. "We need a roadmap for media impact control." Another scoffed, his tone like acid on flesh. "The media isn't the issue. We are the issue. You think Ford uses the press to attack? You're mistaken. He uses his silence to expose us." No one responded, because that was no longer a comment, it was a verdict on the entire system present, each individual included. A concise slide appeared containing only one sentence: "Not everyone is a target, only those who believe they never are." The quote had no attribution, no signature, but everyone knew it was one of the core training principles Ford imparted when he led the federal law enforcement ethics program. Someone had once laughed upon seeing him print it on A4 paper and tape it to his office door, considering it an intellectualization of professional instincts. That person had since resigned without submitting a letter. The system merely recorded, inactive since date. No one dared to reach out. No one wanted to know the reason. A former FBI HR director had once rejected Ford's promotion proposal when he was a regional coordinator. The reason given was succinct: lacks leadership through interaction. Now, the man once deemed non-interactive was orchestrating an entire plan to silence the apparatus using the very trait he was criticized for. No one spoke openly, but everyone exchanged glances, understanding that every past remark was now manifesting as evidence against the commentator. Ford's retaliation didn't lie in actions, but in creating conditions where each person turned against themselves. As the meeting concluded, there were no chair movements, no farewells, only glances exchanged, full of suspicion as if each person wondered, "Am I being watched? Am I the next test subject?" No one dared to ask aloud. No one dared to whisper. Elijah Ford needed no further moves. The entire system had now confined itself within a labyrinth with no exit, where every word was self-incrimination, every opinion a signal to Ford that the next prey had revealed itself. The closed-door meeting in Washington ended without applause, without a conclusion, without anyone daring to speak loudly. But its echo bled like a slow, icy drip through every level of law enforcement nationwide. Those who once believed themselves at the top of the power chain now looked around like marked animals, unaware when the hunter would raise the scope toward them. But the punishment they feared did not arrive by siren, verdict, or manhunt. It came in the form of a slow, traceless absence. On Monday morning, at the Central City Police Department, 3 high-ranking officials did not show up for the weekly briefing. No one received an absence email. No internal announcement was made. Just familiar names. Those who once orchestrated street crackdowns, who laughed arrogantly in courtrooms, suddenly gone. Their desks remained untouched, coffee cups still warm, but their personnel files vanished from the system. When the HR officer tried to access them, A chilling red message appeared. Access revoked. Tiered security clearance required. These were the ones who once sneered at Ford sitting silently in the back row of the courtroom, who patted each other on the back and half joked, half mocked, "Where the hell did that guy crawl out from?" One of them, less than 3 months ago, had publicly rallied to clean up the nameless black protesters under the guise of security. Ford was present that day. No one remembered, but the cameras did. One recording showed him being stopped near the barricades, told to raise his hands while merely taking notes in a notebook. "I see your hands shaking. Got anything in your pocket?" The officer's voice rang out, casually, like target practice. That officer is no longer found on the personnel chart. One of the 3 missing had sat in the front row during an internal meeting when rumors surfaced that the defendant had once worked for the federal government. He scoffed, slammed the table, and said, "Don't bring TV drama into the courtroom." A colleague recalled him ordering a full review of all body cam footage to catch a moment when that guy slipped up. But when nothing surfaced, he demanded the footage of Ford being escorted be edited with fake screams for the year-end party. Now, that footage is gone, and so is he. No one can reach him. One officer had shouted in Ford's face when he was asked to rise from the courtroom bench, "There's no seat here for delusional men." That line was clearly recorded by the judge's desk microphone, yet was omitted from the public transcript. After the trial, he shared the audio clip with friends, captioned, "Bet he thinks he's some silent agent." That clip was later traced from recovered data. No disciplinary ruling followed. But in the system, his profile no longer belonged to administrative classification. Under the job title, only 2 words remained: pending. A data analyst recalled that Ford once mistakenly entered her office while the court was inspecting evacuation diagrams. Instead of helping, she snapped a picture of him from behind and sent it to a group chat with the caption, "Stranger can't read signs. Where's security?" Later, realizing the stranger was the FBI director, she tried everything to delete the image, but the app had saved it to cache, and now that very photo appeared in the training slide, titled Internal Arrogance Culture. She took 3 days off after seeing her face reflected in the ethics lesson Ford authored. The HR officer tried to access the profiles again, but was met with the same cold red message: access revoked, tiered security clearance required. A young officer, after entering the wrong password 3 times to access his supervisor's file, received an internal call. On the other end was a monotone female voice. "Stop. Do not attempt again." He froze, hung up, and looked around. Everyone else in the room avoided his gaze. No one spoke. No one asked, but everyone knew something was happening, a kind of purge without notice. No reasons, no judge. Just this morning, they were here. By afternoon, they were no longer part of the system. The room once used for Tuesday morning briefings, where Ford had been mockingly nicknamed Ghost Man for his unnerving silence, had become a temporary vacancy zone. An old photo was found on a deleted hard drive, capturing a staff member secretly photographing Ford from behind and adding a humorous filter to share internally. The caption read, "Waiting for him to speak turned my brain to stone." That staffer had once been nominated for a federal officer training program. Now, his records were erased from all databases. A staff member responsible for issuing guest passes once denied Ford entry on trial day for not meeting the enforcement dress code. Later, she recounted in a social meeting that he stood there for a long time, silent, just staring into the glass door, as if waiting for someone inside to decide on her behalf. Everyone burst out laughing at the story. But when the conversation was matched verbatim by background audio logs and mirrored in Ford's own unpublished report, she was notified she'd be taking a temporary leave for emergency personnel response retraining. Reason listed, unclear. Handling level, internal, code G8. In the headquarters parking lot, a row of personal vehicles sat like unclaimed corpses. A security guard scanned the car tags to identify owners. The system rejected all access attempts. flashing only one line, "User does not exist." He turned to his colleague and sighed. They weren't fired, they were erased. The other nodded silently, as if confirming an irreversible truth. On the east wall of the main hallway, where quarterly employee honor photos used to be displayed, the picture of a captain who had once shouted, "Clear the path for the lead clown," as Ford entered the courtroom, was removed. No one was informed. By the next morning, the frame held only a faint white void. A few people asked, but no one answered. An assistant who had indirectly witnessed the incident requested a job transfer, relocated to the ground floor to be less scrutinized. In the logistics office, an access card was tossed on the table. No one knew whose it was. The system recorded that it had been revoked by Central Command. All prior access history tied to that card had been wiped. An anonymous message appeared in an internal chat group that had once thrived on mockery and ridicule. "The FBI doesn't punish, they erase." No one replied. No one dared trace the sender. It was as if the entire internal network was being watched from within. No permission needed, no trace left. An administrative deputy director had once openly mocked Ford's conduct in the previous week's meeting, saying, "If he's qualified to investigate me, I'm qualified to be Attorney General." Internal recordings captured roaring laughter after the remark. But just 5 days later, his work account was frozen, all email access revoked, personal folders re-encrypted under special authority. No one dared ask if he was still employed. Only one detail lingered. His nameplate was removed from the office door at midnight. Some were reassigned, but no one knew where they went. In the personnel system, their names were replaced with coded symbols. No receiving department, no reporting officers, no transfer records. A female administrative officer asked her superior about a deputy director's sudden absence and was met with a stare like a cold pin piercing her forehead. Ask again, and you're next. She shut her mouth, returned to her desk, and quietly deleted his name from the meeting schedule. In certain small meeting rooms, there were empty chairs that no one dared to sit in, not out of respect, but out of fear. Fear that merely sitting in the wrong place, opening the wrong file, or speaking a bit too loudly could mean that by the next morning one would no longer be part of the existing data. No one had to be fired. No order had to be issued. Somehow the system simply knew who should remain and who should vanish, and it carried that out with precision, silently, more cleanly than any termination process ever devised. In the media, no one was removed from office. No article mentioned a purge, but within the ranks, whispers spread like legend. It's not that Ford isn't responding. He's erasing every ink stain on the map with a formless eraser. Some former officers tried to contact old colleagues who had just been reassigned. Each received the same signal. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. One daring soul texted a personal number. "Where are you?" The message showed as read, but no reply came. 6 hours later, his phone was locked out of system access. The disappearances became a silent warning. They needed no announcement, no effective date, no rebuttal, and that made them more terrifying than any public investigation. A career death with no funeral. A purge with no verdict. The name was gone. The data erased. ID photos taken down. Emails wiped clean. All as if they had never existed. In an emergency meeting on post-crisis staffing structures, it was discovered that all internal evaluations for over 20 employees directly involved in Ford's trial were no longer on the server. A technician attempted data recovery and found only one code string. Silence is the audit. He turned to the supervisor and asked, "Who has the authority to delete like this?" The other gave no answer, just stared at the screen, then placed his personal phone on the table, as if afraid the device might be listening. In the heart of the city, a small memorial wall dedicated to outstanding public servants was dismantled. No reasons given, but no one dared keep the photos taken down. They were placed in boxes, unlabeled and not returned, as if the very honor once celebrated had become unacceptable in the current moment. On a closed forum for high-ranking law enforcement personnel, someone posted an old photo taken with Ford, when he was just a faint name on a seminar guest list. Beneath the picture was a caption, "The guy who never smiled." Within 2 hours, The post was removed and the poster's access was blocked. No notice, no reason. But the next day, his official ID was tagged, "Review pending clearance." All system access was immediately revoked. A colleague whispered, "He must have forgotten. Old photos are more dangerous than fresh crimes to some people." At the office of the now replaced chief of police, a thick printed list was placed on the desk. No one was convicted, no one fired. Only one category no longer exists in the system. A handwritten note in black ink, stamped red at the bottom, read, "Executed per security directive. Internal Moral Purge Protocol/EF. No one dared ask what the last three letters stood for. No one wanted to. No one needed to. It was understood to carry more weight than a decree. It was an erasure order by someone who did not need to be present to decide the existence of anyone within the system. And that was enough. Empty chairs went unreplaced, names unmentioned, and silence crept like cold smoke through the corridors of power. But just then, when fear had occupied every space once illuminated by the law, a leak shattered the murky fog with a truth more bitter than any disciplinary measure. That courtroom trial was no accident. It was a plan. Written, tested, anticipated for 3 years. The first clue came from an internal source, a system note accidentally exposed when an internal audit staffer opened the wrong encrypted folder. Inside, a dry-titled document appeared on screen. Ethical Compliance Live Experiment / filed by E. Ford. Timestamped with the original submission date 3 years prior. Beneath were lines of description. Objective: monitor and assess levels of ethical deviation within local law enforcement agencies under non-intervention conditions. And in bold, the final line: requirement: do not disclose authorship until the system fully reflects upon itself. Shortly after, an internal log leaked on the agency's intranet revealed that Ford had once been denied access to a low-level security system while trying to print training materials. The IT employee who blocked him justified it with, "He's an outsider, no login privileges." In a follow-up email, the same employee added sarcastically, "These black folks love pretending to be agents." No one flagged the remark then. Now the log is preserved in all new recruit training packets as living proof of how seamlessly bias operates when no one intervenes. A crowd reception tracking software used during trials indicated that a local reporter once edited footage of Ford being escorted, added mocking background music, and uploaded it to an entertainment platform as a visual joke. In less than 12 hours, the video garnered 1.4 million views and over 80,000 comments, many mocking Ford's appearance, posture, and unwavering gaze, dubbing him Silent Gorilla. Once his true identity was revealed, the content creator deleted their account, but duplicates remained, like ink stains on a whiteboard that can never fully be erased, reminding everyone that there was once an era where ignorance wore the mask of laughter. An internal email sent among district court administrators before the trial showed one coordinator writing, "Recommend placing the defendant on the single outer seat. Don't want to tarnish the jury's image." Another replied, "Guy with no records, no lawyer, no address, sitting anywheres like trash." After the fallout, both were suspended, but no reason was listed. The final line on the disciplinary form ended with an ellipsis, just like the only comment Ford ever left online. A security guard had once kept Ford outside the courthouse lobby for not dressing according to federal standards, calling in 2 colleagues to ask some questions. No official footage existed, but the interaction was indirectly captured via security audio. One voice said, "He's silent as a statue. Probably shocked we caught him faking." That recording was later reclassified, not destroyed, but repurposed for instruction. Once a covert accusation, it became the opening clip for a new training module titled, "When the Examiner Must Re-Examine Himself." On social media, a mocking hashtag campaign once went viral with an image of Ford among uniformed officers. Spot the thug. Users competed to guess the criminal, with one post shared hundreds of thousands of times, reading, "Just look at how he stands. You can tell he's used to facing trial." That very post later headlined a major investigative article titled bitterly, "When a Nation Learns to Judge by Posture and Skin Tone." Every word, every misplaced laugh, every wrong gesture during that trial had been foreseen. Every crude reaction, every slur, every careless share button, each fit the predictive curve Ford had submitted 3 years prior. He wasn't planning to defend. He built a test so those who thought they were the examiners would expose themselves, believing no one was watching. Elijah Ford was never wrongly accused. He was the stage builder, the script writer, and the man under the spotlight, simply watching who would break themselves first. That courtroom wasn't where he was humiliated. It was the trap he laid for an entire system to reveal its true face, and every piece fell into place. Each sneer, each contemptuous glance, each burst of laughter, every moment had been calculated. No one realized that within that courtroom, over 8 disguised cameras had been installed in blind spots 3 weeks in advance. Audio, visuals, biometrics, everything was recorded, everything analyzed. That day, before the trial, Ford sat alone on a stone bench behind the courthouse. A logistics worker passing by mistook him for homeless, tossed him a tri-folded flyer, and coldly said, "Free meals at the street corner, go the other way." That man, upon later seeing Ford walk out of court wearing a badge labeled Director on his chest, forgot how to breathe for nearly a minute and never returned to work again. In the West Hallway, a group of law students on a field trip saw Ford pass through security. One of them, face still marked with teenage acne, secretly recorded him and commented like a YouTube narrator, "See that? Looks like one of those emotionless serial killer types from Mindhunter." The video was instantly shared among friends, tagged with the hashtag cold-blooded creep. No one apologized, but none of them continued studying law after that semester. A court clerk, once tasked with distributing preliminary documents to both parties before the trial began, saw that Ford had no legal representation and mocked, "No family, no lawyer. Must be the kind nobody wants to touch." That statement echoed from a ceiling corner camera, the audio faint, but the contempt in his eyes unmistakable. 3 weeks later, the clerk requested a transfer to logistics, citing personal reasons, but co-workers noted that from that day on, he never looked anyone in the eyes for more than 2 seconds. It wasn't that Ford was silent. He didn't need to speak. Another internal note leaked from the exposed documents read, "We don't need to resist, we just need to witness." The wicked always think it's safe to reveal themselves when no one reacts. He didn't react, and that was the most devastating blow. A strike without force, only patience. One behavioral surveillance report noted with chilling precision, the target's stillness triggers oppressive reflexes from observers. As predicted, the less resistance, the more primal the system behaves. Within the FBI's internal Tier 0 clearance files, accessible to only 3 people across the agency, was a full dossier on a plan titled Project Mirror. Inside was a stratified diagram of predicted behaviors, from biased speech and mocking gestures to satirical video edits and abuse of authority. Everything had been modeled in advance. Ford wasn't reacting. He was comparing real behavior to a prediction model, and every step, every laugh, every averted gaze matched. The nightmare for the system wasn't that Ford knew in advance. It was that he had engineered everything to make the system expose itself. Each participant, each officer, each student, each attorney became an unwitting test subject dropped into an unannounced moral audit. No one was entrapped. They were simply placed in conditions where ethics were no longer enforced and their raw instincts surfaced like a corpse in still water. When no one is watching, people choose to be themselves, and Ford, a conductor of a new century, simply waited for that moment. That day in court, a young defense lawyer secretly snapped a photo of Ford sitting quietly before roll call and sent it to an internal group with the message, "Today's display case looks light on data," hoping for a plot twist. Not only was there engagement, but another member used the photo to create a meme template for the Try Not to Laugh challenge adding synthetic laughter and cheap background music, playing it aloud from a phone just as the judge entered. The courtroom stirred briefly. Then everyone pretended not to hear. The clip was later recovered from a seized laptop, but no charges were filed. Not serious enough, but for Ford it was data. For the system, it was evidence. In the south hallway, a security officer once shoved Ford's shoulder for standing too close to the boundary tape, then muttered just loud enough for cameras, "If you don't know where to stand, don't come here." When asked why, he replied, bluntly, to teach him his place. No one intervened. A passerby scoffed. Another sighed. All were coded into the reaction heat map. The shoulder shove glowed red. No one knew how it would be scored, but Ford knew. A student observer scribbled a note in her journal. Probably the type who can take a beating. Face shows he's used to shame. That line was captured by a low-angle camera mounted on the front row. When reviewed, it was flagged 3 times for racial bias markers. She never realized that page would be included in a report to the National Ethics Oversight Center. When she later received internship rejections from all 5 agencies, no explanation given, she began to understand a fraction of it. No one dared call him a victim. No one called him director. They started using an unofficial, internal title, the man who rewrote moral architecture. But even that carried resentment and fear. No one likes realizing they were a test subject, especially in a plan they weren't consulted on, weren't prepared for, and were never given a chance to correct. Just before the trial, a maintenance worker refused to let Ford borrow a power outlet, assuming he was there for legal aid. He even called security to remove this strange man. Once Ford's identity was revealed, the worker filed for indefinite leave, leaving only a handwritten note. "I flipped the switch on a system I don't understand." Another document leaked from a task force Ford once trained clearly stated, "No need for direct attack. Just create conditions for the system to perform itself." And perform they did, completely, surpassing expectations in cruelty, contempt, and behavioral distortion. A behavior summary chart categorized reactions: red for overt discrimination, yellow for mockery, and orange for silent complicity. The result, the entire chart glowed. No white zones. More brutal than the truth was Ford's non-reaction after the leaks. No statement, no denial, no confirmation, no appearance, no explanation, because, as noted in a final line of a classified file, a system does not need moral instruction. It needs to see itself naked in the mirror and live with the consequences. And Ford, cold as an unfazed hand, followed that principle. He remained silent, because he knew his silence was the clearest mirror of all. Immediately after Project Mirror leaked, social media began dissecting every moment of the trial. An unofficial clip resurfaced from an audience member's live stream. In it, a court staffer handed Ford a water bottle, but intentionally dropped it at his feet, sneering, "Pick it up, silent one." Ford just looked. No bend, no touch. The staffer smirked, picked it up himself, and turned away as if he'd won something. The clip is now shared millions of times, with the caption, "The world saw who was truly small." Another surveillance log showed Ford being asked twice to stand and undergo screening by the same officer, who claimed, "Your watch looks odd." When reminded that the check had been done, the officer replied, "Just making sure." No one interfered. No lawyer objected. Everyone kept their heads down, pretending to review documents. But the behavior chart later marked this as micro-oppression, systemic, non-physical violence, one of the rarest red tags, now blazing on the response map. An interagency email revealed that a betting pool had formed, guessing whether Ford would snap or cry before the trial ended. The winner received a $50 Starbucks gift card, and the team laughed hysterically reading the results after the session. Once the truth emerged, none remained in their roles. One moved to logistics, one disappeared from the system. The initiator was last recorded in a temporary HR cubicle with an undetermined status. Reporters asked, who authorized him to do this? No one in government dared respond, because the president had approved the plan in a coded executive order, a moral wager with the nation's conscience. They never expected the bet would hit so precisely, and they never imagined the one flipping the coin didn't care to win. Those who once laughed, scoffed, or dismissed him as filling a seat now live with an indelible sense that every action of theirs was recorded, not just by devices, but by conscience. A former judicial aide, who once slipped a note to a colleague saying, "I smell him from here," when Ford walked past, later sent an apology email to the Federal Ethics Office. It was never replied to, but it was archived. Not for forgiveness, but as proof the system is beginning to confront itself. For Elijah Ford, that trial wasn't a climax. It was only a prelude, a signal, a raised eyebrow that said, the system has entered the test, and he is preparing the next chapter. He doesn't need a sword. He doesn't need to expose anyone. He just stands still and watches each person unravel themselves, one by one. People always imagine the conclusion of a moral purge to be a gunshot, a triumphant declaration, a curtain torn by floodlights and applause like thunder. But when Elijah Ford's plan was complete, when each link had fallen from the rusted chain of the system, when the smug faces that once sneered had fallen silent in chairs they no longer deserved to occupy, that was when Ford appeared. Not on television, not at a grand press conference, not to reclaim his name or demand justice. He walked into a closed conference at Quantico, like a drifting wisp of smoke, light, cold, and enough to drain the air from the room. The room had no name that day, no event title, no printed agenda. The invited had no clue what they were about to hear or from whom. They only knew they had to be there. No tardiness. No absences. The chairs were set in a semicircle, the overhead lights dim enough to reveal the faces across, but not enough to read emotion. A large screen behind the stage remained blank. No title, no logo, nothing to indicate this was a high-level briefing, but everyone knew it was the absence that made them uneasy. Then the door opened. Elijah Ford entered as though he had never left. No one introduced him, no need to rise. No applause, only the sound of his shoes, clicking like pins on glass. He wore a dark gray suit with no insignia, no badge. One hand held a thin leather notebook, the other slipped into his pocket, as if merely passing through a corridor, not walking into the room where the next generation of the nation's law enforcement sat taut with apprehension. No one knew what he would say. No one dared to guess. Guessing wrong now meant not understanding him. And that at this point was a sin. A year earlier, in this very hallway, he was seen standing by the coffee machine he wasn't allowed to use. A mid-level employee unplugged the power and barked, "For people who work here, not drifters." No one defended him. Onlookers laughed like they'd witnessed refined satire. That video, once edited with sitcom laughter, circulated through a private group chat titled, "The Shadow Thinks It's Real." Weeks later, an IT staffer, now resigned, submitted a meme of Ford to the internal bulletin, replacing his face with a cartoon black character in court, adding a head-exploding animation. The image spread so fast that it was printed and taped to the fifth-floor restroom used by senior leadership. Everyone saw it. Everyone knew. But no one removed it, until the truth surfaced. Then the image came down in silence, leaving a pale square of wall behind. Unpainted. Within the FBI's own training curriculum, a veteran instructor once used Ford's image in a slide labeled "Improper Posture in the Face of Authority," emphasizing that silence isn't always strength. Sometimes it's stupidity. That lecture was never retracted. No public retraction was issued. That instructor stopped teaching. No one asked why. Even among security personnel, where discipline is sacred, Ford was once forced to wait 45 minutes for a body search because an officer claimed his eyes didn't look civilian. Ford didn't resist, didn't react. But cameras later captured the officer's pale face when he saw Ford flash his FBI credentials. Weeks later, he couldn't speak, and left the building after an emergency meeting. All of this had happened, like needles beneath skin, ignored by a man who never flinched. And now that man stood before them, his gait unchanged, his silence unbroken, offering no moral lecture. Just his presence turned once amusing memories into stains on the conscience of every person in that room. No names needed. They all remembered their own. No one laughed. No one moved. No one dared recall the past aloud, because they knew they had been test subjects in an experiment they never realized had begun. And now, the man they once saw as background noise had entered like the stage itself, the light, the final unclosed curtain. He stopped in the middle of the room, not on a podium, not beside a microphone. He didn't raise his voice, didn't scan the crowd like a commander. He simply lifted his eyes, slowly surveying the room like inspecting the architecture of a mind he already knew. Then he spoke, just 7 words, even, measured, without excess force. I came to see the system reflect. No one exhaled sharply. No one stood. No applause followed. The sentence didn't seek validation. It needed no emotion. It cut like a thin blade through the air, silent but deep. Everyone present understood. None of them were spectators. They were mirrors, and Ford had come only to see what those mirrors now revealed. The man who once laughed aloud as Ford was dragged from the courtroom, wrists bound behind his back, was now curled in his seat like a schoolboy caught in a civics lecture. In the mental projector of his own guilt, he replayed every word. Looks like someone stumbled out of a Tarantino flick. He had once filmed it, cursing while calling Ford the kind of trash society needs to toss out to feel cleaner. The clip never leaked externally, but since Ford emerged from court with an FBI badge, it had become an evidence file in his own conscience. A woman in the front row, once a senior admin, had refused to admit Ford, saying, "We don't receive anyone without appointments," though the waiting room had been empty. When asked why, she replied, "His face says he's not worth meeting." That quote was once graffitied in the women's restroom, beside a cartoon of Ford waiting alone between 2 turnbacks. It's no longer there, but the janitor remembered her sitting there for an hour that night, just staring at the fading ink. An agent once attached Ford's name to a meme in a chat group called Blue Shield Memes Only, showing a silent man amid an interrogator captioned, "How unemployed losers think they're agents." It became a recurring joke in psychology classes, until Ford revealed his real badge, and the group vanished in under 2 hours. The meme maker later transferred to administrative duty. No explanation. Everyone knew why. No one asked. Another officer, sitting at the back, once laughed during a meeting when someone said Ford walked like an undocumented smuggler who doesn't qualify to use staff restrooms. He coined the nickname Ghost, not for mystery, but because he claimed, "The guy's like a ghost, no one bothers to notice." Later, he was told to surrender all personal electronics. No charges filed. In a system learning to reflect, disappearance needed no justification. It was simply a consequence. No one asked questions. No one recorded, yet all of them, without a cue, opened notebooks. Each wrote 1 line. No consensus, no command. Just instinct. When faced with someone who shattered institutions through silence, words became useless. Only the record remained. Proof they were there. They heard, they saw. A young agent in the last row scribbled so fast his handwriting faltered. His silence weighed heavier than any verdict. Ink smudged, letters crooked, but he gripped his pen as if afraid the thought might slip away forever. And he knew, they all knew, Ford wouldn't be remembered for what he did, but for that moment of doing nothing that forced them all to look inward. He didn't stay, didn't turn left to enter a private room, didn't sign a single document. He left exactly as he had arrived, without sound, without the spotlight. But the room had changed. No one was the same. His presence wasn't to restore order. It was to confirm one thing. The system had seen itself, and no one could pretend otherwise. Among the seats, still warm from clenched postures, the air hung silent, like glass, shattered, but not yet fallen. A man who once led internal security training, a recent keynote speaker at a federal ethics summit, now sat, head bowed, eyes red not from emotion, but from disarray. He remembered the technician who brought Ford in for a volunteer interview years ago. He'd rejected him at first glance, skin tone, silence, demeanor. Later at lunch, he joked, "No way the system let someone like that near the center." Now that very system had been reflected to its core. There had once been an internal meeting on the third floor of the FBI Academy. A female supervisor mocked Ford, waiting by the copier. "This spot's for employees. Try legal aid if you're lost." Ford said nothing, just checked the building map and left. 2 minutes later, she texted, "Guy's face is stone. Probably unstable." That message later appeared in an ethics report, not released, but enough to end every promotion track she thought was certain. In the hallway leading to the parking lot, a pair of young officers walked in silence. One turned to the other and whispered, "Why didn't anyone applaud?" The answer didn't come in words, but in a slow shake of the head, a shake not meant to express surprise, but a kind of quiet reverence, because people only applaud when something ends. And Ford, he didn't end anything. He only opened a door, a crack, a reflective surface that the entire system would spend decades looking back into. No one could forget that winter day last year when Ford, still unknown at the time, was asked to step back 3 paces at the security gate because the system could not recognize him. The officer on duty that day raised his voice. "Step back. What are you staring at me for?" Then he turned to his colleague and added, "I hate that kind of silence. Like a dog that won't bark." That statement was recorded by his own microphone, and later became sufficient evidence to revoke his internal access without needing to provide any official reason. No one disciplined him. There was no need. But after a closed-door meeting at Quantico, he was seen submitting a resignation letter with only one line written, "No longer compatible with organizational culture." A senior instructor, someone who had trained hundreds of agents, closed his office for an entire week after that same meeting, refusing to receive any students. In his journal, he wrote only one sentence: "When the one who audits morality no longer needs to test, it means he is certain the system has already exposed every flaw on its own." And in an office down the auxiliary wing, there was an assistant who had once interrupted Ford during a request for file assistance with a bitter voice. "I don't have time to listen to half-spoken lines from random strangers." At the time, Ford merely smiled, a smile neither forced nor irritated, but strangely calm. She didn't think much of it until she saw his face on the internal bulletin the day his identity was revealed. Since then, she's arrived earlier than usual every morning, not to work, but to make sure she never has to face the very name she once dismissed like a meaningless gust of wind. In the internal transcripts of that meeting, there was no speaker's name listed. No Elijah Ford. There was no need. Everyone who attended understood it wasn't the event, it wasn't the speech, it wasn't the lesson. It was his existence itself that was the final message, an existence that was not loud, not chaotic, not performative, but made every previous noise seem absurd, and every promise that followed hollow. After the conference at Quantico, Elijah Ford's whereabouts became unknown. No images at the airport, no internal calls, no camera footage. Yet his presence lingered, not physically, but in every decision, every cautious word, every wary glance of the next generation. People no longer asked, "Who is he?" but whispered another question: "Is he still watching?" The obsession with him stemmed not from his title, but from unforgotten memories. In the first-floor hallway, whispers persisted that before everything unfolded, an officer had once forced Ford to bow his head for a shoe inspection, a disguised humiliation ritual. That captain even recorded the incident and shared it in an internal chat group, accompanied by an emoji depicting a hand pressing down on a cartoon character with dark skin. When the video leaked after a courtroom twist, the captain's own wife slammed the door, kicking him out with the words, "Who do you think you're making a joke of?" Elsewhere, stories circulated about an afternoon just before the trial, where Ford stood silently in the rain behind the headquarters corridor, shoved in the chest by a young intern without an apology. who then turned around to take a check-in photo with the caption, "Bumped into a homeless guy. Bad luck all day." Less than 48 hours after Ford's true identity was revealed, the photo became a digital stain, with netizens exposing every comment, every like, every participant. The student vanished from all platforms, and it said he no longer pursued a law degree. A clip replayed during an internal presentation showed Ford being publicly mocked by the very person presiding over the trial, who squinted and asked, "Do you have anything to say?" then smirked, inviting the audience to laugh along with a mocking shake of the head. When Ford looked up and replied, "No," no sound was heard, but the camera captured his dry lips and eyes like blades piercing each person who thought themselves righteous. That presiding officer has since resigned. No reason, no explanation, just a handwritten note, "I am no longer fit to sit in judgment." Amidst this wave, an old officer who once loudly declared in court people like him should be sent back to slavery times was disowned by his own son, who changed his surname to his mother's on his birth certificate and announced a complete severance of ties. In political and law enforcement life, consequences rarely come through guns or handcuffs. They arrive as invisible lashes, cutting into honor, seeping back into family, conscience, and future. A week later, on an early autumn morning, as the sun had yet to fully rise in the east, a young officer, newly assigned to the FBI headquarters, officially stepped into the third-floor hallway, the area reserved for executive levels. He wore a freshly issued suit, a brand-new name tag, and unscuffed leather shoes. His steps were tense yet eager, like all those who have yet to understand that power doesn't lie in where they enter, but in places they're not yet old enough to consider. He passed by a large glass door, polished to a mirror-like shine, reflecting every movement. On the glass was an inscription in faint gold ink, not glaring, not dazzling, but hauntingly clear. Elijah Ford, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. He paused, not out of doubt nor to admire, but because that name at this very moment, in this very place, had become something he couldn't overlook. So many stories, so many rumors, so many news pieces and removed photos, locked files, people who once mentioned this name with disdain and then fell silent. And now that name stood here, on the glass door, at the heart of American power, as if there had never been a trial, as if all previous upheavals were a collective societal dream, and he was the only one awake. He looked into the glass, but what he first saw wasn't that name but himself, faintly reflected in the light, a young face, tense, eyes filled with unknowns. Behind his reflection, that name remained still, unmoving, unfaded, unyielding. He wondered softly, without voicing it, wasn't he once put on trial? That question, though unspoken, echoed in his heart like a solitary drumbeat, not out of doubt, but because he knew, from this moment on, he had stepped into the same hallway Ford once walked, the same organization where he once sat silently, the same system he had compelled to self-reflect. He had read what was allowed to be published and what circulated beyond official channels, like the story of a security guard who once deliberately closed the elevator door as Ford approached, for no specific reason other than his skin being too dark and his attire not exuding a sense of power. That guard wasn't fired. He resigned after 2 months, unable to endure the silent gazes of colleagues once they learned who Ford was, or the tale of an administrative assistant who deliberately mispronounced Ford's name during an internal roll call, calling him by a derogatory term. Accompanied by a sneer and laughter from the group behind. Footage of that day was never broadcast, but the recording circulated internally as an unspoken ethical document, causing those named in the clip to quietly disappear from all promotion lists the following year. One can't forget the hallway camera footage showing Ford walking past a group of technicians having lunch, and one of them forcefully throwing a sandwich wrapper at him, saying, "Clean this up, you're stinking up the whole floor." Ford didn't react, just walked on as if he hadn't heard. But in that frame, every reaction was recorded. The complicit glances, the tight-lipped smiles, and the silent complicity of those who neither spoke nor intervened. When his true identity was revealed, none of them remained in their previous positions. No decisions, no announcements, simply no longer existing in the system. The story that sent shivers down his spine the most was a rumor from a night shift janitor that on the last day before the trial, Ford was denied service at the ground floor corridor cafe. A young barista with a disdainful attitude bluntly said, "We don't serve anyone without a badge or at least a suit that exudes a sense of power." Ford just nodded, said nothing, and turned away. 3 days later, when the girl learned she had turned away the FBI director with the haughty gaze of someone lacking the knowledge to recognize ethics, she personally sent an apology letter, though no one was sure if it ever reached him, or was just kept as a belated lesson among anonymous files. He touched the glass not to open the door, just to check if it was real, cold, solid, and without a trace, as if Ford had never existed in the flesh, but only left an inscription by name and by shadow. The door didn't open, didn't need to. It wasn't meant to be passed through. It was meant to reflect. And in that moment he understood. Some doors aren't meant to be entered, but to know what you're ready to face. Then he moved on, without looking back, without taking a photo, without telling anyone, because that door and that name weren't for show, not for gossip. They were for those silent enough to understand that the greatest stories don't end with applause, aren't told with pride, but live on in moments unspoken, yet unforgettable. At the end of the hallway, where light filtered through the frosted window, he saw the first lines of the new training document for young officers. The line had no date, no author. It simply read, "Justice doesn't need proclamation. It only needs to be reflected."